The moment my boots touched the floor of Waystation Keth 9, something changed in the air. I felt it before I saw it. A shift, a pressure. Like every molecule in that wide vaulted atrium had suddenly become aware of a new variable, and was recalculating in real time. The station was busy. It was always busy. 6 species moved through it daily, trading fuel cells, biological samples, treaty documents, and whatever else passed for commerce this far out on the rim of claimed space. Voices overlapped in a dozen frequencies. Cargo lifters hummed along the upper rails. The smell was a layered, complicated thing. Part recycled air, part something like salt, part something I had no word for. I was the only human in the building. My name is Yarvar Ose. I am 34 years old. I hold a doctorate in xenobiology from the University of Cape Coast, a second in comparative sensory evolution from Edinburgh, and a field certification in non-hostile contact protocols. I do not carry weapons. I have never served in any military branch. I stand 163 centimeters tall, and I weigh 58 kilograms. And on any street in any city on Earth, I would be the last person anyone crossed the road to avoid. I had been assigned to Keth 9 for a standard 3-month research rotation. My job was to observe, document, and do absolutely nothing dramatic. My equipment was a field recorder, a portable spectrometer, a translator node clipped behind my right ear, and a battered green bag I'd carried since my first posting on the Kepler relay 11 years ago. My escort was a diplomatic protocol unit, a boxy, sensible machine that walked beside me and displayed my clearance codes in whatever visual format the station's current occupants preferred. The protocol unit registered nothing unusual. I registered everything. The first to notice me were the Kethval, who ran 4 of the merchant stalls along the eastern wall. They are broad, low creatures, built close to the ground with wide flat heads and eyes that sit far apart on either side. Prey animal configuration, in the most technical sense of that term. They are not prey. They are excellent traders and deeply suspicious diplomats. But their visual system is wired for threat detection in the ancient, involuntary way. And every single one of them stopped what they were doing within 4 seconds of my arrival. Not 4 seconds after I introduced myself. Not 4 seconds after I spoke or made any gesture. 4 seconds after I simply walked through the door and stood in the light. The nearest one, who had been arranging a display of circuit components with practiced speed, placed both upper limbs flat on its counter and went completely still. The one beside it leaned back by approximately 10 centimeters. The stall 2 down from that one, and I was watching carefully now, because something was clearly happening, quietly repositioned itself further from the aisle. No dramatic movement, no alarm signal, just a slow, instinctive retreat from whatever it was seeing when it looked at me. My protocol unit pinged a soft chime. No threat indicators detected on registered passenger HFY proceeding to check-in bay 7. I said hold. The unit stopped. I stood still and I looked at the room, not at any one thing. I just let my eyes move slowly, the way you do when you're trying to understand a scene, rather than find a specific object in it. The Srilani diplomat in the far corner. I had read about the Srilani. Everyone who worked this region had. They were the station's current hosting authority, and their negotiators were legendary for composure. Had stopped talking mid-sentence. Her conversation partner, a Varese trade representative with a body like a folded length of rope, had turned slightly so that its back was no longer fully toward me. Neither of them moved toward me. Neither of them ran. They just recalibrated. Found a new position in the room that put them at a slightly different angle relative to where I was standing. I took out my field recorder and started talking into it very quietly. Timesman 091 arrived at Keth 9 main atrium. Immediate behavioral response from at least 6 individuals across at least 3 species. Responses consistent with threat recognition rather than curiosity. No vocalizations directed at me. No approach. Primary behavior pattern. Spatial repositioning. Reduced movement. Sustained visual attention. My protocol unit shows nothing. I am wearing standard civilian travel clothes. I have no weapon designation on my manifest. I am trying to remember if I stepped in something. I had not stepped in anything. I walked to check-in bay 7, and the aisle stayed clear ahead of me for the full length of the atrium. Not because anyone ran. They just happened to be somewhere else. The check-in officer was Srilani, young I thought, based on the documentation, though I was still learning to read Srilani age markers with any accuracy. Her name, according to her station badge, was Athu, and she was assigned to diplomatic liaison, which meant she spoke passable Terran Standard with a musical, slightly overlapping quality, like 2 notes played very close together. She greeted me with the correct protocol phrase. She processed my documents without error. She did not lean away from the counter. She also, I noticed, did not lean forward the way most Srilani do when they are in what they consider a non-threatening interaction. She was perfectly carefully neutral. "You've been here before?" she asked. "First time at this station," I said. "I've been in Keth space before, Relay 4 and the survey post at the edge of the Andhari belt." "Alone?" It was a strange question from a check-in officer. "Usually," I said. She looked at me for a moment with those large, dark eyes that the Srilani use for infrasound detection as much as vision. Then she said, "You should know that the Drav cargo in Bay 12 was sedated this morning for transport prep. They will be calm when you pass. You will not need to take a different route." I stared at her. "I was going to suggest," she said, "that you might prefer the lower corridor. It is less direct, but it avoids the main cargo floor." "Why would I need to avoid the cargo floor?" She chose her words with great care. "The Drav are not dangerous to you, but their handlers would prefer a quiet morning." I thought about that for a long time as I walked to my quarters. I thought about the merchants who had moved their stalls. I thought about the diplomat who had stopped talking. I thought about what, exactly, a room full of species that had evolved on completely different worlds, under completely different suns, could possibly have in common in how they process the sight of one small, unarmed human woman standing in a doorway. I put my bag down on the bunk in my assigned quarters. I plugged in my spectrometer to charge. I sat on the edge of the mattress and I opened my field recorder and I said, "Hypothesis 1, mistaken identity. Someone who looks like me, or traveled this route before me, did something memorable." Checking manifest records. The records showed no prior human presence at Keth 9 in the last 14 station months. Hypothesis 1 eliminated. I stared at the ceiling, which was a soft gray-green, the color of old jade. Hypothesis 2, something about human biology that I, a xenobiologist, somehow do not yet fully understand. I let that sit in the recycled air for a moment. "Field note," I said. "That would be embarrassing. Also fascinating. Let's find out." I lay back on the bunk with my recorder on my chest and listened to the station breathe around me. The hum of its vents, the low percussion of its docking clamps, the faint, complex smell of 6 different kinds of life going about 6 different kinds of business. Somewhere in the lower decks, past 2 levels of sealed cargo doors, 40 non-sapient herd animals were sleeping off a sedative, having been judged calm enough not to require a different corridor for my benefit. I was very curious about that. I was also, if I am honest, something else. I was a little bit thrilled, not in any way I could justify scientifically, just in the way that happens when the universe taps you on the shoulder and says, "There is something here you do not understand yet. Pay attention." I paid attention. I went back out into the station 2 hours later and started taking notes. The Srilani, as a species, had not survived on their homeworld by being wrong about threats. Their planet, Srill, orbits a dense, dim star at the outer edge of its habitable zone. It is a cold, quiet world, and quiet on Srill has a very specific meaning. It means the thing hunting you has not decided to move yet. Srilani evolved in dense forests of a species of tall, spore-producing plant that blocks almost all visible light at ground level. They see poorly in what humans would call standard light. They hear everything. Their infrasound sensitivity, the ability to detect sound frequencies far below what most species register as audible, developed as their primary survival mechanism over approximately 40 million years. A large predator moving through the forest produces infrasound just by moving. The Srilani hear it before they see it. They have been hearing it before they see it for longer than humans have had written language. I had known all of this before I arrived. It was basic xenobiology covered in first-year coursework. What I had not known, until I sat across from Athu in a small meeting room off the main diplomatic corridor and asked her carefully to explain what she experienced when I walked into the atrium, was that a normal human-speaking voice in its lower registers produces infrasound. Not a lot of it, not continuously. But when a human speaks at conversational volume with any kind of resonance in the chest, when a human uses the lower third of their vocal range, the range most humans use without thinking during relaxed, confident speech, they produce a low-frequency vibration that radiates outward and that the Srilani, every single Srilani within approximately 8 meters, registers not as speech but as a territorial rumble. I had been warning the room every time I opened my mouth. Ethu explained this with diplomatic patience and what I suspected was mild personal amusement, though I was still learning to read Srilani facial expression with any precision. "It is not threatening in the way that a direct challenge is threatening," she said. "It is more like, you know the way a very large animal will rest in a space, and the space itself will seem to belong to that animal? Not because it has claimed it with any action, simply because its presence is large enough that the space reshapes around it." "Yes," I said, because I did know that. I had filmed it. Elephants did it. Certain large bears did it. The environment itself seemed to acknowledge them in a way that had nothing to do with anything they were actively doing. "That is what your voice does," she said. Every time you speak in your lower register, every Srilani in the room hears a very old signal that says, something that belongs here is telling us it belongs here. And because we have been reading that signal for 40 million years without getting it wrong, we believe it. I wrote this down, then I said, and the visual response, the Kethful. Athu tilted her head in the Srilani gesture that meant something between patience and let me find the correct words. I am not Kethful, she said. But I have spoken to them, and I have read some of their perception literature. The Kethful evolved alongside something called the Vreth. Do you know what the Vreth is? It took 4 seconds, an apex predator. Extinct now, but it was the dominant large predator in Kethval historical range for approximately the last 20 million years of its existence. Binocular vision. Up stance during final approach, eyes with a very high ratio of visible sclera, the white. I stopped. I looked up from my tablet. Athu watched me. Humans, I said slowly, have more visible sclera, more white showing around the iris than any other known sapient species, by a significant margin. The Kethval do not have a category for a sapient creature with forwarded-facing eyes and exposed whites, Etha said. They have 2 categories, prey and vreth. You do not look like prey. I sat with that for a moment. The vreth had been extinct for roughly 11,000 years. The Kethval had built a civilization, developed space travel, joined an interstellar community, and developed trade law. They had done all of this with the vreth recognition circuit still running, still live, still classifying forward-facing eyes with exposed whites as the apex predator it had spent millions of years learning to recognize. Not as a memory, not as history, as a present-tense automatic cannot be turned off biological fact. Every human has forward-facing eyes. Every human has visible sclera. Every human walking into a room with Kethful present is, at a level below conscious thought and beyond conscious override, triggering the one threat signal the Kethful nervous system was most thoroughly designed to never ignore. I realized I had been tapping my pen against my tablet. I stopped. How long have humans been interacting with the Kethful? I asked. 47 standard years, Athu said, and in 47 years no one documented this. She paused. The Kethful do not like to discuss the vreth. It is considered, another careful pause, not a mark of sophistication to acknowledge that a creature still triggers the response. Their philosophers argue that the response is vestigial. Their neurologists have confirmed that it is not. I wrote this down too. Then I went and found the freight manager for the Drav cargo. His name was a series of tonal sounds I couldn't quite manage, but his station badge displayed the syllables that most non-Drave speakers settled on, which sounded approximately like keel. He was a small, neat species, not Drav himself, but a contracted handler from a species called the Teth, who had worked with Drav livestock for generations. He was initially reluctant to talk to me about the morning's sedation decision. He became somewhat more open when I explained that I was a xenobiologist doing formal field research, that my questions were scientific, and that I found nothing embarrassing about any of the answers he might give. He told me the Drav had begun agitation behavior approximately 20 minutes before I arrived on the station. I asked him how that was possible. He looked at me with an expression that I was fairly certain, across species lines, meant, I was hoping you would not ask that, he explained. The Drav is a herbivorous herd species, non-sapient, roughly the size of earth cattle, with an olfactory system sophisticated enough to track a predator's scent trail for up to 90 hours after the predator has left an area, had begun reacting not to me but to the ship I arrived on, not even the ship, the atmospheric filtration exhaust from the docking port that had processed my ship's air recycling, a residue of human scent, specifically, the trace compounds associated with meat digestion, with the particular microbiome of a long-haul traveler, with whatever complex olfactory signature a single human body leaves in a recycled air system after 14 hours of transit, had reached the cargo bay through the station's ventilation network, and the Drav had known. Something with the scent profile of an apex predator had docked. Something that ate meat and walked on 2 legs and had been metabolizing animal protein for decades had entered the building, and the Drav had known before I was even through the airlock. They weren't agitated, Keel told me. Agitated is when they can't decide which way to run. They weren't doing that. He paused. They were very still, very quiet. They were all facing the same direction. Which direction? He pointed. Which was, I calculated, approximately the bearing of docking bay 3, which was where I had come in. 40 herd animals, all facing the source. That's a prey recognition response, I said. That's what my supervisor said, Keel confirmed. He said to sedate them because if they stayed in that state too long, they would stress damage their joints. They lock their muscles when they do that. I thanked him. I walked back to my quarters in the lower residential corridor, past 3 Kethval who watched me the whole way. past a cluster of Vares who reorganized themselves against the wall with a fluid, almost choreographed subtlety, and I sat down at my small desk and I opened a new document and I wrote one sentence at the top of the page. Humans are triggering apex predator recognition responses across multiple unrelated species, through multiple unrelated sensory channels, without any active behavior, purely through biological baseline characteristics. I looked at it. Then below it I wrote a question. How did we not know this? And then below that, a second question that bothered me more. How did every other species already know it, when we didn't? I had been trained to observe. I had spent 11 years watching how alien life recognized, categorized, and responded to other alien life. I had published 32 papers on cross-species sensory communication, on how different evolutionary paths produce different perceptual worlds, on how a creature that evolved under one set of pressures will see the universe through the lens of those pressures forever, no matter how sophisticated it becomes. I had never once thought to turn that lens around and point it at my own species. I started doing it now. I pulled up every biological reference I had access to on human sensory characteristics, not from a human perspective, not the usual documentation of what humans can perceive, but the inverse question. What do humans emit? What signals does a human body produce that it is not aware of producing? What does a human look like, smell like, sound like, to a sensory system that did not evolve alongside one? The data was there. It had always been there. It just had not been assembled in this particular order. For this particular question, I worked through the night. The station's lights shifted through 3 cycles while I sat at my desk with 2 screens and a physical notebook. And the longer I worked, the quieter and more focused I became. And somewhere in the back of my mind I was already aware that I was feeling something I would need to examine, carefully, a kind of wonder that was edged with something fiercer, something that felt, if I am honest, very much like the first stirring of pride. I tried to keep it scientific. I did not entirely succeed. The corridor on Level 4, Section G, between Cargo Bay Access Point 11 and the docking relay junction, is approximately 40 meters long and lit with the amber frequency panels that the Srilani prefer for their administrative areas. At its widest, it is about 4 meters across. It has no intersecting passages for 30 of its 40 meters. If someone were placed in the middle of that corridor and something were to come in, from one end, the person in the middle would have exactly 2 choices: go toward the thing coming in, or back away from it. I was walking toward the relay junction when I heard the sound, not a loud sound, not a sound that on Earth would have made me tense. It was a low, rapid clicking, rhythmic and controlled, and I recognized it from my preparation files. It was Vares communication, specifically the frequency range the Vares use for short-range coordination, not conversation, coordination. I stopped walking. The amber light made everything look like an old photograph. At the far end of the corridor, between me and the relay junction, 3 Vares had positioned themselves in a loose arrangement that I recognized, again from files, as the shape they take when they are waiting for something to arrive, not waiting to speak with it, not waiting to trade with it, waiting for it to come to them. Because Vares ambush behavior is triggered by movement, and they had positioned themselves where they knew movement would happen. Ethu was between them and the wall. She had her back to the wall panel, and her translator node was in her hand rather than behind her ear, which told me the conversation had moved too fast for the standard interface. Her posture was controlled, but her secondary hearing membranes, the small translucent panels along the sides of her head, were spread wide. In Srilani biology, that meant the equivalent of every nerve standing at full attention. I had been walking. I stopped. The Vares at the front of the group turned toward the new sound, my footsteps ceasing, and registered me. I will not tell you that I thought through what I did next. I did not. There was no sequence of logical steps, no rapid processing of xenobiological literature, no conscious decision. Something much older than my doctorate or my field certification, or my 11 years of careful scientific observation simply took over. And it did what it had been doing, apparently, without my knowledge for my entire life. I looked directly at the lead Vares. Not a glance. Not a quick assessment. I looked at it the way you look at something when you want it to know that you see it. Fully, with both eyes forward, with the whites showing at the outer edges of my irises in the way that is simply how human eyes are built. I looked at it the way the Vreth, in whatever deep fossilized memory the Kethval nervous system still carries, had once looked at the thing it had chosen. And I took one step forward. Not fast, not aggressive. One slow, deliberate step, the weight of it landing heel to toe, the posture upright, the shoulders easy, the eyes never leaving the lead Vares. The lead Vares did not move toward me. It moved back, not dramatically, not a leap or a scramble, just a single step backward, and then it angled its body slightly, reducing its frontal profile the way things do when they have decided, a level below thought, that a direct confrontation is not the correct choice. The two behind it shifted position in response, not running, not fleeing, simply redistributing their weight into a configuration that gave more space between themselves and the point of contact. I kept walking, not charging, not rushing, just walking the same pace I had been using before, with my recorder in my left hand and my bag over my right shoulder and my eyes steady. I walked the full length of the corridor. I did not look back. The clicking had stopped. My footsteps were the only sound. When I reached Aethu, she stepped away from the wall and matched my pace without a word, and we walked together to the junction and through it, and then up a short flight of steps to a wider, more open corridor where other station traffic was visible, and only then did either of us stop. I became aware that my hands were steady. I had expected them to be shaking. I checked. They were not. Aethu looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You knew they would back down." "No," I said. And this was the complete truth. I had no idea what they would do. She considered this. "Then you did that with no certainty of outcome." "I did that with no plan at all," I said. I stopped. I thought about how to describe it accurately, because accurate description is the job. Something moved my feet. I don't know how else to say it. She was quiet for a moment, in the way the Srilani are quiet when they are processing something that does not fit their existing framework. Then she said, "The Vares will not approach you again, for the rest of your stay." "How do you know?" "Because you did the one thing that makes them stop," she said. "You move toward them. Nothing that is genuinely afraid moves toward the thing it fears. It is a simple rule. Prey animals do not do it. The only thing that moves toward the source of danger is something that believes, at a level it does not need to justify, that it is not the one in danger." I looked back the way we had come. The corridor was empty. "I was the one in danger," I said. "Yes," Aethu said, "but you did not move like you were." I raised my recorder. "Field note," I said, speaking quietly. "Instinctive threat display response in high-pressure situation produced behavioral outcome consistent with dominant species signaling. No weapons. No protective equipment, no prior planning. Subject, that's me, had no conscious awareness of executing a specific strategy. Recommend follow-up analysis of whether this reflects training, cultural conditioning, or something more fundamental." I paused. Then I added, "Also recommend checking whether adrenaline response accounts for the fact that my hands are completely steady. That seems like it should not be how that works." Aethu made a sound I had not heard from her before. It took me a moment to recognize it, because it had a harmonic quality that was distinctly Srilani and entirely genuine. She was laughing. We walked back to the residential level together. She answered my questions about Vares threat assessment biology with the thorough, careful precision of someone who had spent years in diplomatic postings learning things that her species scientists had not yet formally published. She told me that the Vares had evolved as ambush specialists on a world with almost no open terrain. Their entire survival history had been constructed around the principle that you never reveal yourself to something that has already seen you. Because if it has already seen you, and it is not running, it is either not afraid of you, or it is about to demonstrate why. She told me that the Vares term for the category I had just placed myself in, translated as loosely as possible into any concept a human sensory experience could access, was something like the kind of thing that walks toward you. There were only two natural things on the Vares homeworld that walked toward you, things that hadn't noticed you yet, and things that had and didn't care. One step forward had told every neuron in the lead Vares's nervous system, without a single word being spoken, exactly which one I was. I lay on my bunk that night, and looked at the jade-colored ceiling and thought about the 10,000 generations that stood behind that one step. All the dark mornings and all the long nights and all the learning that had become reflex, that had become instinct, that had become, somewhere along the way, simply the way human bodies move through the world when something is in the way. We had not learned it in any school. It was not in any manual. It had never been given to us as advice. It was older than advice. It was older than language. I thought about that for a long time. Then I thought about what else I had not yet understood about what I was carrying. With me quietly in this ordinary body, through every room I entered, I started a new section in my field notes. I called it, "Things Humans Are That We Have Not Yet Documented Properly." It was going to be a long section. The station's central archive was accessible to registered researchers through a standard data terminal on level 2, and I had been sitting at one for 6 hours when I found the Srilani Threat Assessment Index. It was not a restricted document. It was public access, in the sense that any researcher with appropriate credentials could request it from the Srilani Diplomatic Archive. It had simply never occurred to any previous human researcher to request it. Because previous human researchers working in this region had been asking the usual questions: political structure, trade law, biological classification, the long and careful work of learning what others were, rather than examining what we looked like to them. The index was 412 pages long and covered 97 distinct species or species groups that the Sri Lanka Diplomatic Service had formally assessed over the last 200 standard years. The assessment framework was based on their infrasound sensitivity, their visual threat classification system, and their extensive experience as a negotiating species in multi-species environments. They had developed, over 2 centuries, a classification system for how different species registered on the threat perception systems of others, not just Sri Lanka, but others. They had done the work of becoming the room's most attentive observer and writing down what they noticed. Humans appeared in the index. We had been given a classification. It was the one I had feared and the one I had suspected, in the way that you suspect something before you have the evidence, and then find that the evidence is worse than you imagined. The classification heading, translated as cleanly as my translator node could manage, read: unresolved, simultaneous multi-channel apex activation, behavioral prediction impossible, engagement approach, caution and distance recommended. I read it 3 times. Then I read the subentries. The Sri Lanka threat assessment system works on a 5-channel model: infrasound, visual profile, movement pattern, scent signature, and what they called behavioral predictability index. How well a species' next action could be anticipated based on its previous actions and its physiological state. A high predictability species in threat assessment terms is safer to be around, not because it is less dangerous, but because you can model what it is going to do and plan accordingly. A low predictability species is dangerous regardless of its actual capability, because you cannot build a reliable response to something you cannot read. Humans scored at the ceiling on every apex threat channel. Infrasound. The lower registers of human speech produce territorial rumble signatures across the frequency range associated with large predators on no fewer than 12 documented worlds. The Sri Lanka noted this was the broadest cross-species infrasound match on record, not because human voices are louder than predators, but because the tonal quality of human resonance appears to be a statistical near match. 4 predator frequencies evolved independently. Across multiple biomes, we are in some frequency sense accidentally universal visual, forward-facing binocular eyes with the highest exposed sclera ratio of any known sapient species. The sclera exposure matters because it evolved in humans for a reason: social communication, tracking gaze direction in cooperative groups. But the shape of the signal is identical to what a predator produces when its eyes are locked on a target. We evolved it for teamwork. Every other species with that evolutionary history reads it as aim. Movement pattern. Humans walk upright, with a spine fully vertical, in a stance that places the eyes at maximum elevation. The upright bipedal configuration is documented in the Sri Lanka archive as associated with dominant or apex species on 11 surveyed worlds. On every one of those worlds, it is the predators that stand up to their full height. Prey animals keep low. The tallest point in the room is usually the most dangerous. Scent signature. The combination of meat-based diet compounds, specific intestinal microbiome markers, and what the document described with delicate scientific language as the olfactory profile of a generalist. Apex consumer, meaning a species that eats a wide variety of things including other animals, at the top of its food chain, with a digestive system that has been processing meat for hundreds of thousands of years. The Drav had known. The Drav had always known. It was in the air around every human who had ever stood in a space that other animals later entered. Behavioral predictability, 0. That was the score. Not low, 0. I stared at it. The Sri Lanka entry explained. The problem with predicting human behavior, according to 200 years of diplomatic observation, was that humans did not behave consistently according to their physiological state. A human in visible physical distress might still move forward. A human alone might behave more aggressively than a human in a group. A human with no apparent advantage might still hold position. A human who had every reason to retreat might instead sit down and start asking questions. The standard models for predator behavior and the standard models for prey behavior both failed when applied to humans, because humans were documented doing things from both categories without apparent pattern. The Sri Lanka Threat Assessment Service, after 200 years of data collection, had formally classified us as unpredictable in the most technical sense of that word. Not random, but not modelable. We had behaviors that no existing framework could reliably anticipate. Their recommendation: maintain respectful distance, respond to human communication with full cooperative engagement, do not allow humans to stand behind you. That last one had been added as a note to the diplomatic field guidance approximately 40 years ago, following a trade negotiation where a human observer had simply walked around the table to look at a document more closely, and every Sri Lanka delegate had stood up simultaneously. They had not been able to explain it at the time. The xenobiologist's retroactive analysis had concluded that the movement, one human moving behind a seated group, had triggered a synchronized predator flanking response in the room. The delegates were not aware they had stood up. They found it profoundly embarrassing upon reflection. The note had been added to prevent future incidents. I had been walking around the station for 3 days without knowing any of this. I thought about every room I had entered, every aisle I had walked, every moment when a space had cleared ahead of me with a quiet, effortless efficiency that I had been recording as an interesting behavioral observation. It had not been interesting. It had been, from every other perspective in those rooms, a completely rational response to the presence of something their biology had been correctly reading for, longer than they had known what stars were. They were right. They had been right every time. I pulled up the comparative evolutionary analysis I had been building across the last 3 days, and I went through it with the Sri Lanka document open beside it, and I started cross-referencing, and what I found methodically, carefully, with all the precision of someone who has been trained to be precise, was that there was not a single biological signal the human body produces in baseline rest that does not trigger an apex recognition response in at least one other known species. Not one. We had somehow, through a combination of evolutionary pressures on a single ordinary planet, ended up expressing every threat signal that every other species had independently developed the sensitivity to detect. We had not evolved to do this. It was, in the most technical sense, accidental. The forward-facing eyes, for social gaze tracking, because we hunted cooperatively and needed to see where everyone on the team was looking. The exposed sclera, for communication, because being able to see another human's gaze direction from a distance made us better at coordinating. The upright stance, for heat management and endurance, because early humans ran prey to exhaustion on open ground, and standing tall helped cool the body in direct sun. The infrasound resonance, a side effect of a vocal apparatus that evolved for the most complex and flexible sound production system on the planet, used for language so nuanced and intricate that the low-frequency spillover from our resonance chambers was simply never something we needed to worry about, because the things around us that could hear it were not things we were trying to reassure. The scent profile. We ate everything. We had been eating everything for a very long time. Our digestive chemistry reflected that with the faithful accuracy of a biological history written in enzymes. None of it was designed, none of it was intentional. Every signal we produced had been shaped by entirely different pressures, toward entirely different ends, and the fact that the entire package landed as a coherent, cross-species, multi-channel apex declaration was not something any evolutionary biologist on Earth had ever had reason to document, because on Earth, there was no one else to ask. I closed my eyes. I thought about the savannah. I thought about what it meant to be the species that had survived there. Not because we were the strongest or the fastest or the most heavily armored. We had been none of those things. We had been endurance and cooperation and tool use and problem solving, and somewhere along the way, the accumulated signature of all of that had assembled into something that the rest of the galaxy, meeting us for the first time with senses honed on their own evolutionary nightmares, received as a single, unanimous, cannot-be-ignored message. I thought about a HFY philosophical text that Athu had mentioned on my second day. She had referenced it in passing, and I had made a note to find it. I found it now. The translation was imperfect. Philosophical texts always are, but the relevant passage had been rendered as, "The creature that cannot be read is more feared than the creature that is large. For the large creature may be avoided, but the unreadable creature is already inside your judgment before you can think to close the door." I sat with that for a while. Then I wrote in my field notes, in very plain language, "We are the creature that walked into the galaxy's judgment, and the door was already open, and no one on either side of it fully understood what had happened." Outside the archive window, the station traffic moved in its ordinary rhythms. HFY, Sri Lanka, Vares, 3 other species I had not yet fully catalogued, all going about their separate days. And somewhere 2 levels down in Bay 12, 40 drave herd animals stood in their calm sedative quiet, and I knew, without needing to check, which direction they were facing. The morning I was scheduled to leave, I woke up before the station lights shifted from their night cycle. I lay stillfoot in the blue-gray dark, and I listened to the station breathe. I had gotten used to its rhythms over the past weeks, the deep, regular throb of the primary life support on the level below me, the intermittent clang of the docking clamps adjusting for thermal expansion, the distant, Complex murmur of the ventilation system moving recycled air through 42 levels of shared living space. I had started to find it comfortable, the way you find any place comfortable once you have learned its particular sounds. I thought about what I was taking home, not the data, though the data was real and solid and would take years to fully publish. And I was already planning the papers in the back of my mind with the part of my brain that never entirely stops being a scientist. Not the recordings, though I had hours of them. Not even the formal documents, though I had filed requests for access to 3 more years of the Srilani Threat Assessment Archive and received a response that surprised me. Not a standard approval, but a personal note from the head of the Srilani Diplomatic Research Division, which said, in Terran standard, with the clean precision of someone who had worked in the language for a long time, we have been hoping a human researcher would ask these questions. We have a great deal more material than you have yet requested. Please come back. What I was taking home was harder to name. I had left Earth as someone who studied how other species perceived the universe. I was to assume as one who governed, somewhat by accident, that the universe had been perceiving my species in a way we had never documented and had never thought to ask about. The discovery was scientific. The weight of it was something else. It is one thing to understand that you carry a particular kind of presence in a room. Most people have some version of this understanding about themselves. You know whether you tend to make people comfortable or tense, whether you take up a lot of social space or a little, whether rooms change when you enter them or stay more or less the same. You develop this understanding through feedback, through watching how people respond to you over a lifetime. We had had no feedback. There was no version of this understanding available to a species that had only been meeting other species for 47 years, and that had spent most of those 47 years asking the very reasonable questions of who are you and what do you want and how do we trade and how do we avoid misunderstanding. All the necessary questions, all the correct first questions. The question of what do we look like to you had not been on anyone's list. It had not seemed urgent. We were the newcomers. We were smaller than most of the species we met. We were less technologically advanced than many of them. We arrived with open hands and careful language and an entirely genuine desire to be good at this, to be the kind of species that fit into a larger community with grace and good faith. And the larger community had been watching us walk into rooms and setting off every threat alarm they had ever evolved, quietly, without saying anything, because it is very difficult to explain to a polite and clearly well-meaning visitor that you are not afraid of them, and also your entire nervous system is classifying them as the most dangerous thing in a 1,400-meter radius. I got up, I packed my bag. I ran through the checklist I always run before leaving a posting: recorder, spectrometer, notebooks, the small photograph of my parents I keep in the outer pocket of my bag, because it was the first thing I packed on my first posting, and it has been in every bag since. I did all of this in the ordinary way that I do it, which is efficiently and without ceremony, and then I sat on the edge of the bunk for a moment and looked at the jade-colored ceiling one last time. Then I went out into the station. The cargo bay shift was early. I had timed my walk to the shuttle port to take me through the lower levels in the 40-minute window when Bay 12 would have its morning access panel open for the handler's pre-departure checks. Not because I had anything specific to do there. I had made no formal arrangement. I simply wanted to walk that way, for reasons I understood now that I had not understood on the first day. The handler named Keel was there, as I had thought he might be. He was doing his morning check with 2 of his colleagues, moving through the bay with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done the same routine so many times it has become a kind of quiet music. He saw me come in, he stopped. I did not say anything, I did not announce myself or explain. I simply walked into the bay at the ordinary pace I walk everywhere, eyes forward, posture natural, and I moved along the near wall of the space without hurrying. The Drav responded within 8 seconds. There was no sedative today. They had been cleared for transport. Calm enough, the medical report would say, to be certified for the journey. And they were calm. That was precisely the word. Not sedated, not frightened into stillness. They settled, the low, constant shifting that large herd animals maintain even in enclosed spaces. The small adjustments of weight, the movement of heads, the micro changes in formation that mean a group is monitoring its environment for threats. Slowed and then stopped. They oriented. All of them. With a unanimity that would have been eerie if I had not, by now, spent 3 weeks learning to read it correctly, turned toward the wall where I was walking and held that orientation. Not because they were afraid, because the predator was in the room and the predator was not hunting, and in every herd animal's oldest and most reliable library of information, that meant this was the safest moment they would have. I walked the full length of the bay slowly. I did not look at the Drav directly. I had learned, from Keel's description of their behavior, that direct eye contact from a forward-facing predator is a different signal from simply being in a space. I kept my gaze loose, forward, general. I let them hear my footsteps and smell whatever it is they smell when I walk past and make whatever calculation they make. By the time I reached the far door, the bay was the quietest it had been all morning. Keel watched me walk back out. As I passed him, he said, in the halting but careful Terran standard of someone who had been practicing, "They slept better last night than any night this rotation." I looked at him. "Your quarters are directly above Bay 12, he said. One level up. I had not known that. I thought about it all the way to the shuttle port. 40 animals sleeping well, because something their biology recognized as the apex had been directly overhead, and had not been moving with hunting intent. I thought about what it meant that the most frightening thing in the building was also, for 40 non-sapient creatures operating on pure evolutionary logic, the thing that made the building safe. Ethu met me at the departure gate. She was not alone. Behind her, 2 paces back and to the right, was a tall Srilani official I had not met, older, from the markings, with the careful stillness of someone who has been in formal diplomatic service for a long time. Ethu introduced him as the senior attaché for the Srilani delegation's research liaison office. He inclined his head in the formal Srilani, greeting for a respected equal, and then delivered a message, which Ethu translated not because it was necessary. His Terran standard was excellent, but because she had apparently been asked to, for the formality of it. The Srilani delegation had filed a formal request with the Multi-Species Council. They wanted a human observer present at the next border arbitration session, not as security, not as a party to the negotiations, as a presence, a recognized, documented, formally invited presence seated at the table, because 6 months of preparatory work had produced a situation in which 2 of the negotiating parties could not be in the same room without their threat assessment systems running at a level that made clear thinking difficult, and it had been noted by someone in the Srilani diplomatic service who had, apparently, been paying close attention that both parties were significantly more behaviorally regulated in environments where a human had recently been present. More regulated, I repeated. Ethu looked at me steadily. The infrasound residue from your voice persists in enclosed spaces for approximately 4 to 6 hours, she said. Both parties have noted that they think more clearly in rooms where the large predator has recently demonstrated that there is no immediate crisis. I stood there for a moment. I thought about this. A human. Unarmed. No mandate. No formal authority. No vote in the proceedings. Just a presence. Just the accumulated weight of millions of years of evolution, producing something that walked into rooms and made the complicated chemicals in other species' nervous systems say, something that knows what it is doing has been here, and it did not find this situation to be an emergency. I would need to consult with the diplomatic office, I said, which was the correct and proper answer. Of course, the senior attaché said, in his own excellent Terran standard. I boarded my shuttle. I stowed my bag in the overhead compartment and buckled in and looked out the small viewport at the gray flank of the station as the docking clamps released. The station shrank. The stars around it did not. I opened my field recorder. Final notes from Keth 9 rotation, I said. Departure time stamp 811, standard. Summary of findings will be submitted in full formal report. Personal addendum. I paused. Outside, the station was now just a shape against the background, and ahead was the long dark of transit, and behind me was 3 weeks of having walked through a building where every form of life I had encountered had looked at my ordinary, unarmed, unaugmented body and received a message I had not known I was sending. Something I need to think about more carefully before I write it up, I said. Not what we are. I think I've made a reasonable start on that. What we owe. The shuttle's engine shifted to its transit frequency. The vibration moved through the seat and through my bones. We are a species that did not know what we looked like from the outside. That is understandable. You cannot see yourself clearly from inside yourself. That is not a failure. It is just a fact of perspective. But now we have been outside. Now I have walked those corridors and watched those rooms and read that archive and talked to Ethu, and I know something that I cannot unknow, and I don't think I would want to. I looked out the viewport. The stars were constant and clear. We carry something with us everywhere we go. We have always carried it. We didn't choose it, and we can't put it down. And now that we know we're carrying it, the question isn't whether to have it. The question is what to do with it. I clicked off the recorder. I sat back in my seat. I thought about the arbitration session. I thought about 2 delegations who could not stay calm in the same room, and about a Srilani diplomat who had looked at the data and decided that one unarmed human seated at a table could change the chemistry of the air. I thought about the Drav, sleeping well. I thought about Keel saying they had slept better than any night this rotation. and not knowing, until that morning, that I had been one level above them the whole time. I thought about the corridor on level 4, section G, and one step forward, and the ancient wordless language of a body that had learned, over millions of years, to walk toward the thing in the room, and let the thing in the room make its own decision. I thought about my field notes, the new section, the long section, things humans are that we have not yet documented properly. I was going to need a bigger notebook. Outside, the stars held their places. Ahead, the route home curved through a transit corridor between 3 systems, past 2 relay buoys and the edge of a dust field that the charts marked as navigable but slow. It would take 14 hours. I had a lot of notes to organize. I thought about the young researcher somewhere, on Earth or on a relay station or on a posting I had not yet heard of, who would read what I published and ask the next question. The one I had not thought to ask yet, the one that would open the next door. I hoped they were ready. I thought that probably, in the way that humans tend to be when the universe offers them something genuinely interesting to figure out, they would be more than ready. They would walk straight toward it.